Epilogue. The world must not forget. The question struck the two speakers on stage like a round from a submachine gun. Mr. Heck, would you have killed Mrs. Waterford if you'd been ordered to do so in the Hitler Youth? Silently, Alphonse Heck cursed the 17-year-old in the audience who had just asked him this tremendously difficult question. Unable even to look at Helen, seated next to him on the stage, Alphonse spoke slowly into the microphone. I'm afraid, young man, the answer is yes. Obeying without question was the ironclad rule by which we were raised. To refuse a direct order in the line of duty, no matter how repulsive that order might be, was simply unthinkable. A gasp of surprise rose from the packed auditorium. The question brought to an end that day's special program at a large California high school. As guest speakers Alphonse Heck and Helen Waterford walked across the parking lot to their cars, Alphonse apologized to her. I'm really sorry you had to listen to that question, but the kid deserved an honest answer. I hope you're not too offended. Helen's answer was quick and quiet. If you had said anything else, our partnership would have been over. I couldn't have trusted you to tell the truth. Half a century earlier, Alphonse and Helen had lived only 60 miles from each other. He in Wittlich, she in Frankfurt. As young Germans, they had watched, one with fear, the other with excitement, as Adolf Hitler made his astonishing rise to power. From the center of the Nazi nightmare, their lives had taken decidedly different directions. One followed Hitlerism, the other, the Holocaust, along a parallel journey throughout history. Until they came to the United States, Alphonse and Helen had never met. Now, with the war 40 years behind them, both were American citizens living in San Diego. Alphonse wrote occasional newspaper articles about his life in the Hitler Youth, and in 1980, Helen read one of them. I had no particular plan in mind when I tried to contact Alphonse Heck. My first reaction was curiosity. That this man had the courage to write publicly about his past showed how different he was from most Germans his age. Many of them denied ever having belonged to the Hitler Youth, even though it was required of all children 10 and older. I did not realize how surprised he would be to get a call from a Jewish survivor. Part of Alphonse's surprise was how friendly and sincere this woman sounded on the phone. She complimented him on the newspaper article and said that his honesty in writing was the reason she had called. She was also curious to hear about the other side. Heck hardly knew what to say. Former Nazis or Hitler Youth members just didn't talk to Jewish Holocaust survivors. There was something unnatural about it. The wall between us was too high for friendly talk. But even as I was thinking this, I felt a twinge of shame. This lady had the courage to do the impossible, something I wouldn't have dared to do. She held out her hand to a once deadly foe. She deserved a decent response. I too was curious about the other side. Despite all my reading about the Third Reich, I had never talked to a death camp survivor. Mrs. Waterford was surely unique. A survivor who didn't appear to hate all Germans, even those who served Hitler willingly. I had to meet this woman. Helen invited Alphonse to join her at a meeting of other Jewish Holocaust survivors. The group lectured to students at local schools, and Helen presumed they'd be as anxious to meet a former Hitler Youth leader as she was. Expecting an interesting session, Helen introduced Alphonse to the group. Immediately, 2 people left the room. The rest avoided looking at him altogether. Feeling like a suspect in a police lineup, Alphonse sat quietly throughout the meeting. On their way out the door, no one offered to shake his hand. Helen was shocked and upset by the group's reaction. It was all my fault. I knew I had caused Al great embarrassment. The meeting showed clearly that hatred and vengeance are so strong that most people are ready to attack without even wanting to learn or listen. It was clear to me that this group was not interested in any German's story. nor would they want anything to do with me if I were to lecture with Alphonse Heck. Then and there, I decided that under no conditions would I ever give up my freedom to speak with whomever I choose. The idea of teaming up with Alphonse Heck to do joint lectures had already formed in Helen's mind. Alphonse was also intrigued by the idea of speaking publicly about his years in the Hitler Youth. He realized this could put him in an embarrassing and dangerous situation. But here was a way to confront his past, a way to ease the burden he had carried for decades. Yes, he told Helen, he would like to try lecturing with her. I listened spellbound to Helen's straightforward, unemotional story. She told it like she was performing an autopsy on her own life. There was no hand-wringing or feeling sorry for herself. In fact, she did not want her audiences to show pity for her. I decided that I, too, must keep my talk cool and factual. From the time of our first lecture, I made it clear that while Helen spoke for her dead, I also did for mine. I spoke for the children of the Hitler Youth who had been sacrificed for our Führer's dreams of power and glory. Thus began a partnership that would last nearly 10 years. Shortly after their first lecture, Alphonse and Helen were guests on Good Morning America. Articles about them ran in the Los Angeles Times, the Chicago Tribune, and many other big city papers. A major magazine called them the Odd Couple. They appeared on TV and radio talk shows throughout the country, and later on CBS Night Watch. Most often they spoke to junior high, high school, and college students across the United States. In the audiences, there might be 800 to 1,000 people, and yet the auditorium would be absolutely quiet. Everywhere they spoke, their stories made a lasting impression on people. Your honesty and courage at revealing your personal lives cannot help but leave a tremendous impact on your listeners, the head of one college wrote them. I cannot believe that any of us left your lecture without a new understanding of history that will change our lives forever. This came as good news to Alphonse, for he had been worried about how the audiences would accept him. I was relieved after the first lecture that none of the listeners were hostile toward me. In fact, it was just the opposite. People praised me for my courage in speaking out about my past. They appreciated my honesty when I told them how enthusiastic I had once been about the Hitler Youth. The way we presented our stories never changed after the first lecture. Starting with 1933, each of us told about a portion of our life, alternating in chronological order through the end of the war. Honesty, we agreed, was the only rule. We could say whatever we liked as long as we told the truth. Honesty was the major reason this delicate partnership worked. Alphonse and Helen trusted each other. Although they disagreed about many modern issues, particularly politics, they respected each other's knowledge of the war years and knew that the events each of them described were true. But there were some listeners and readers who rejected what Heck and Waterford said and criticized what they were doing. Alphonse was threatened by skinheads and neo-Nazis who accused him of insulting the memory of the greatest man who ever lived, Adolf Hitler. Helen was confronted by revisionists, people who claim the Holocaust never happened. For them, she had only one reply: I do not discuss such important topics with ignorant people. Sometimes Jewish audiences showed more disgust toward Helen for speaking with a former Nazi than they did for Alphonse for being one. In our audiences, there were survivors, many of whom had not seen a Nazi since 1945. Yet when they found a man honest enough to admit he had once been a Hitler Youth fanatic, they reacted like bulls attacking a red cloth. I got more upset than Al during these very unpleasant encounters. Then, suddenly it happened against me. Hate exploded, noisy, mean. Naturally, I realized that some people would not agree with what I was doing, but I felt helpless when a group of 10 to 12 young Jewish students began yelling remarks that made my life, my hopes, and my successes seem to collapse around me. What kind of a Jew are you? They shouted. You should be ashamed. The young people in this audience seemed unable to separate their hatred of Nazis from their hatred of all Germans, even those born after the war. They could not see that to condemn all Germans reduced them to the same level as the Nazis, who hated every Jew, every Gypsy, every Jehovah's Witness. How long would we continue to hate I wanted to ask them. To infinity? Helen and Alphonse shared an obsession to teach the living, those who could still think with an open mind. They were honest with each other, and they were honest with their audiences. Sometimes, however, it was very difficult and painful to be honest. Without warning, a listener might ask a question that had haunted one or the other of them for years. "Did you ever wish you were not Jewish?" a Kentucky student asked Mrs. Waterford. It took her a moment to reply. "Yes, I did. I thought of this often during 1940 to 1944 when we were hunted and living in hiding. I don't have it in me to be a heroine, certainly not a dead one. I often thought about how much different and easier my life would have been during those years if I had only not been Jewish. But I am a Jew, and over that I have no control." Although it would shock and offend many of his listeners, Alphonse Heck maintained that he and millions of other Germans were just as much victims of Adolf Hitler's insanity as were the Jews, Gypsies, and Jehovah's Witnesses. We, the young fanatics of the Hitler Youth, also became victims of our Führer. We were brainwashed by the Nazis as children, and our love for our homeland was grossly misused. I speak now for my comrades who died fighting for a country whose evil they never had a chance to understand. We became fanatics because we were young and immature. We believed what we heard in our schools and in our homes. By admitting this to you, I am making a silent plea for your understanding. Understanding was something his listeners seemed willing to grant. Forgiveness was something else. The act of forgiving raised too many questions that made listeners uncomfortable and uncertain. Should teenagers be held responsible for their actions? Do children have the power to tell good from evil, right from wrong? Can young people be expected to choose the right course when, all around them, adults are following the wrong one? And when children or teenagers do choose the wrong path, should they be forgiven because of their age? At one lecture, a rabbi asked Alphonse if he thought the Jews ever would forgive the Germans for the horror of the Holocaust. "Not in my lifetime, and probably not for generations to come. The best we can hope for is some amount of understanding." Understanding for what? The rabbi wanted to know. The Germans' guilt is quite clear. Despite the horrible crimes that were committed, most Germans had nothing to do with them. The killings were done under the cover of war, mostly outside of Germany. While you may say that all of us knew, and yet we just stood by and did nothing, this still doesn't mean we were all guilty of mass murder. But because the German people did nothing to stop the killings, 6 million Jews were exterminated, the rabbis persisted. As far as I'm concerned, no German of your generation has the right to ask forgiveness. "I didn't ask," responded Alphonse coolly. There were many people who accused Helen Waterford of being too forgiving in her attitude toward Alphonse Heck and the German people. In their eyes, Helen's partnership with Alphonse made her a kind of traitor. They assumed she had forgiven him, along with the rest of the German people, but Helen had no such feeling. "I want it to be known that I do not forgive anybody anything when it comes to the crimes against the Jews. It is not up to me to forgive. That, if it were possible, would be up to the 6 million who were murdered. You ask me if I have forgiven Alphonse Heck? There was nothing to forgive. Mr. Heck was raised into the Nazi system as a child. He wasn't an adult with mature judgment. I don't blame him." "I still wouldn't sit next to him," her questioner shot back. "You don't have to," replied Mrs. Waterford calmly. Although Helen would not forgive the crimes against the Jews, neither would she bear any hatred against the German people, even former Nazis. Often she was asked just when she had stopped hating Alphonse Heck, as if hating him were something natural that was expected of her. When she explained that she never hated him, or any other Germans, many people, Alphonse among them, found that hard to accept. She assured me that she had never hated any Nazis, even Gestapo men who had arrested her and her husband in their Dutch hiding place. At first I had trouble believing that. I could accept the fact that she didn't hate now, but surely she must have hated them in the past. unless she was a saint. Hatred was expected of Helen, and when people didn't find it, they were bewildered. Even some of her good friends could not understand her attitude. They absolutely would not believe that I did not hate all Germans, since I had felt their power firsthand. What did I expect to gain by not hating? They wanted to know. I explained that I had learned only too well that hate is a boomerang that only destroys the sender. I wanted to build peace, not feed the flame of a never-ending destruction. Both Helen and Alphonse speak for their dead, she for the 6 million murdered, he for the 2.5 million young Germans sacrificed for a madman's glory. But they also speak in the hope of building understanding, helping the readers and listeners realize what happened during those nightmare years. Understanding how a powerful, charismatic leader could brainwash an entire nation may help keep today's young people from following future demented Pied Pipers. Understanding how the Holocaust was allowed to happen may help ensure that it never happens again, Alphonse believes. The overwhelming horror of the Holocaust awakened the consciences of people around the world. It made us realize what truly terrible acts mankind is capable of. Understanding the events of the Holocaust may help to frighten us away from future genocides. But we must never assume it can't happen here in the United States. The fact that it happened in Germany, a land of civilized, creative people, should be a constant reminder to Americans that we must never forget, not only out of respect for the dead, but to guard our own futures. While the legacy of Adolf Hitler may well be my own personal burden, it should also remain a lasting warning to the world. Helen agrees. Not only must the world know that the Holocaust did happen, we must know how it happened, why it happened, and realize that it could happen again, even here, in what we like to call the cradle of freedom. My goal is to share with others the lessons I learned at such tremendous and painful cost. I know now that genocide can happen in any society where people hate those who are different. When we allow ourselves to live with hatred and seek revenge against our enemies, we destroy all hope of understanding and communicating with each other. It is up to me to plant the seeds of this message in the minds of my readers and listeners, and I hope that they will believe me. Only then will I feel certain that my survival has had some meaning.